I think if we're talking about what I think are probably the legitimate issues with a lot of people who go through the quote-unquote deconstruction, I'm not sure that they were given the proper nutrients and foundation and soil quality to be able to grow roots that actually gave them subsistence, so that when those things did happen, it was somewhat too late already. And so I think, what I would want to encourage people is that the point of deconstruction is reconstruction, because if you deconstruct something and you don't reconstruct it, it's just demolition, right? And so your worldview perspective shouldn't be a movement of demolition. Doubt is not a problem, but it's not the destination. So if we see doubt as the destination and we get fixated with that, we're not actually getting to the answers that we should be pursuing in a lot of those things. And unfortunately, I think that's what I see a lot, is that people are kind of taking doubt and they're putting it in the place of the final place where the answer should come from. And they're pushing into their questions, but without actually trying to seek answers. And in that sense, a lot of people become cynics rather than skeptics. Because I'm, to some degree, I'm a skeptic. I will reserve judgment on a particular topic until I feel like I have sufficient answers for any said topic. But a cynic, I think, is doing so because the questions are the endpoint for them. And I think that's where we should be honest and self-reflective and say, maybe there are actually answers that provide sufficient groundwork to actually reconstruct the deconstruction that we've been putting ourselves through. I think we're in a unique point in time where people are open to certain things, and maybe they're in some regards disenfranchised with a superficial religiosity that they may have experienced. If they did grow up in the church, say, in my instance, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of just kind of superficiality, seeker sensitivity that I think had the right motivation, but the wrong method by which to go about that. In that they genuinely saw that they wanted to get people through the doors of the church, which is a good goal to have. But in doing so, what they were trying to win them with is what they won them to. And so because it was very superficial, it was very kind of on the surface, it didn't have any substantial depth. When the winds and the rains of trial and suffering, hurt, did eventually come, there was no root system to be able to ground them. You talked about, that having that foundation before. When my parents lived in Ontario, we moved our family across to British Columbia for a couple of years. And when we did move, my dad, my grandfather, and I drove our van and a U-Haul trailer across the country. And I remember very vividly in Saskatchewan driving across like the very flat fields, right, watching a dog run away for a week, and seeing this giant tree in the middle of the field that just kind of stood out. And it was always this picture of, for me, how did that tree survive? And the answer was, it had a root system that probably was both grounding it and pulling in the nutrients that were required for its particular growth in that point in time. But it's too late for the tree to try to grow the roots in the midst of the storm.
Is there one manuscript, ancient manuscript, that you've held that has completely impacted you, changed your heart, your faith? And how old was it, and which one was it?
I don't think there's one that's necessarily kind of affected me strongly. Every time I get the opportunity to be able to hold in my hand or view something that goes, say, back to the 2nd or 3rd century, what it does for me is it encapsulates the fact that I can, to some degree, standing in front of, say, a 2nd century fragment of the Gospel of John, which I've done, what I feel in that moment is, who was the person 2,000 years ago, almost 2,000 years, who was likewise standing in front of this piece of written material and putting the ink on the page. It's this kind of looking down the timeline of history and including myself in it to some degree, within the family tree of, there's no way to know whether the scribe was a Christian or not, but even hypothetically just kind of putting the idea in that maybe this was a late 2nd century Christian, and it would have been very costly for them to inscribe, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, onto a piece of material in a time frame when they could have been in a region that was illegal to do so. And so being in the family tree of historical Christianity and finding myself on a branch almost 2,000 years later, tying myself tangibly to that point in time, to that person, I think does something to the nature of the faith that I believe, in that I'm not an island. I'm part of a broader story that God has invited me into and invited so many other people, going back to, calling the patriarchs, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is a personal God and invites us all into that narrative and story. So it's this unique perspective of looking at an artifact and the artifact tying my own personal faith journey into.
Have you held any manuscripts that are, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, any pieces of those manuscripts written by somebody who directly witnessed the life of Christ that you're like, this is John. John wrote this. I'm holding it.
No. And the fact is we don't have any documents, written kind of artifacts of papyrus or parchment that would go back that early. The earliest documents that we have of the Bible go back to the 2nd century. But I think what we can say about that is that what we're dealing with, though it be a copy, is a copy that reflects what the original was written about. And this is also testified to by some of the early Christian writers who themselves were disciples of the disciples. So you have this category of people who we call the apostolic fathers, and they're called that particularly because they had a direct tie to Peter, to John, to Paul, and can comment on something like, we know who Mark is. He's the traveling companion of Peter. He wrote down that which Peter told him. We have these kind of testimonies. And so if we're going to call it like the dating of how we know that those documents are 1st century, coming in the eyewitness period, it's less to do with the tangible manuscript evidence that we have in saying, this was written by John, because I'm not even sure how you would identify that, even if we did find a 1st century manuscript.
I think it's my wishful thinking.
Yeah. And I think, in a modern sense, we have the capability to tie things back to, but that's true for everything from the ancient world. We have no document that we can call the original autograph of, whether that's Caesar or whether that's Marcus Aurelius, Plutarch, Xenophon, Tacitus, any of these ancient writers. We're all dealing with copies of copies of copies. And that doesn't dilute our ability to know that that is what the original authors wrote, but it's this fascinating network of the fact that the early Christians were very tenacious to get the gospel message out. And so the fact that we find copies in Egypt, but then also later on in places like Britain and across Asia and all over Europe and North Africa, is a testament to the Christians were very eager to get the message of who Jesus was. And that meant that it was spread very far and very fast, very early on, which precluded any one person or group of people controlling the text at any one point in time. So though we don't have a copy that we can say, actually this is Matthew's copy and he wrote this with his own hand, the fact that we have copies of Matthew that are so widely spread throughout the ancient world, and we can compare them, and even if differences pop up in Asia, we know that those differences are geographically located because we don't find them in Europe or in North Africa. And so if someone wanted to, in a kind of Da Vinci Code-esque way, write in a particular doctrine to the Bible, they would have had to have the means of control to find all the copies in all the other places all across the ancient world and alter them. And that would have been just impossible because there are copies buried in the sands of Egypt. They would have had no idea.
And that's interesting because these stories line up amongst all these copies, these oral traditions that are passed on and written down. The stories about Jesus line up. So you're right. In fact, the more copies there are, the more evidence there is that the stories about him are true and valid.